All right, hello everyone, and welcome to this special webinar on Western drought and heat across the American West. My name is Amanda Sheffield. I am the California Nevada Drought Early Warning System Coordinator at NOAA's National Integrated Drought Information System, or NIDIS as you may know us. I am also with the Cooperative Institute for Research and Environmental Sciences at the University of Colorado Boulder. Before we get started, I just want to first thank everyone who worked to put this webinar together, and thank you all for joining us, and including our co-planners here at the National Integrated Heat Health Information System. First, before we get started, allow me to cover a few housekeeping items. Whoops. I think we've had a little issue with the slides. As you see, you'll see on the slides in a second a few housekeeping items. On this webinar, everyone is muted and the webinar is being recorded. The webinar recording will be available on the NIDIS YouTube channel and links to the webinars page on drought.gov/webinars after this webinar. We have time on the agenda throughout the webinar to take a few of your questions. For your questions, please use the questions box located on the GoToWebinar control panel, and please include your name and affiliation. Before we get started, for our first speaker, I'm honored today to be able to introduce Dr. Sarah Kapnick to open this webinar. Dr. Kapnick is the recently appointed NOAA Chief Scientist. She brings a wealth of expertise at the intersection of climate science and economics and returns to NOAA after a role as Managing Director at J.P. Morgan. Her previous NOAA service spans 10 years at the Geophysical Fluid Dynamics Laboratory in Princeton, New Jersey, where Dr. Kapnick conducted research on seasonal climate prediction, mountain snowpack, extreme storms, water security, and the market impacts of climate change. Dr. Kapnick could be here in person today, but we're grateful that she's recorded her remarks, which we're going to play here in a second. And now, NOAA Chief Scientist, Dr. Sarah Kapnick.
Hello, my name is Dr. Sarah Kapnick, and I am the new NOAA Chief Scientist. This is my second full week on the job, and I'm thrilled to kick off today's webinar, focusing on drought and heat crisis across the Western United States. I care deeply about these issues. I'm a hydroclimate scientist by training. I studied at UCLA, and my PhD research and subsequent years of work were all on Western U.S. drought and snowpack and climate change. What I see today is worse than I thought I would see in this time. According to most recent U.S. Drought Monitor, today over 75% of the Western United States is in drought. The region is experiencing a mega drought, a drought that is the worst in at least 1,200 years. Drought and acidification are impacting agriculture, water supply, hydropower production, recreation and tourism, public health, and ecosystems. Both Lake Powell and Lake Mead, the two largest reservoirs in the United States, are at historically low levels. Long-term drought in the Southwest is not only a regional concern, but a key issue of national significance for all of the impacts it has on various sectors. Additionally, we are also seeing extreme heat in the region. Extreme heat is the deadliest weather-related event in the United States. Summers have been getting hotter, with July of 2021 registering as one of the hottest months ever recorded on Earth. With the expectations of these trends to continue, another way to think about this is it was also one of the coolest summers of the rest of our lives. Increasing summer temperatures put citizens at higher risk of heat-related illness or death, and as the climate change worsens, summers will continue to get hotter and hotter, and potentially more deadly as a result. Extreme heat impacts all of us, rural and urban and tribal communities, the electricity and utility sectors, transportation, healthcare, military and defense operations, and agriculture. It can even cut short sporting events and college graduations. However, all heat-related illnesses and deaths are avoidable. It will take all of us working together to address the challenges of drought and extreme heat to reduce their impact. NOAA remains dedicated to delivery of heat and drought early warning and response information that decision makers need as you grapple with extreme heat and exceptional drought conditions across the West. The challenges required interagency cooperation and coordination across all levels of government. The Intermountain West and the California and Nevada Drought Early Warning Systems are supported by NOAA's National Integrated Drought Information System, or NIDIS, which was represented of a cross-sectoral intergovernmental partnership dedicated to building drought early warning capacity in the region, with the ultimate goal of making the region more resilient during times of drought. Many of the drought products developed by NOAA and our partners are featured in today's webinars to help stakeholders and public monitor and prepare for drought, including the U.S. Drought Monitor, monthly and seasonal U.S. drought outlooks, and the drought information statements from the National Weather Service. The heat outlook will be shared today as a joint effort of the CDC, NOAA, and the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences. It was developed through NOAA's National Integrated Heat Health Information System, or NIHHIS, with support from the U.S. Global Change Research Program, and later operationalized at the CDC. It is built off of NOAA's Climate Prediction Center's one-month seasonal climate outlook. NIHHIS works with local governments and community stakeholders by supporting citizen science urban heat island mapping campaigns, enabling residents to observe and map their own heat islands in their own communities, showing where action will be taken to reduce heat risk. To date, NIHHIS has helped 69 communities map their heat islands and has built a community of practice to help those communities learn from one another of how to reduce heat risk. NIHHIS was jointly created and jointly run with the Center for Disease Control and Prevention. Through NIHHIS, NOAA and CDC came together to develop new integrated heat and health tools. In the Western U.S., NIHHIS has mapped heat islands in Honolulu, Seattle, Portland, San Francisco, Santa Clara, San Jose, and San Diego. In Honolulu, the heat mapping campaign was used to develop the Social Vulnerability Index and to determine where tree planting could help lower outdoor temperatures. In addition to heat and drought, we're also seeing an increase in wildfires. Drought and persistent heat set the stage for extraordinary wildfire seasons in recent years, underlying the urgent need to understand and better predict the extent and intensity of future fires. Collaborative scientific expertise and observations, weather modeling, decision support, social, behavioral, and economic sciences from across NOAA will improve weather, smoke, and fire behavior forecasts. Working with federal, state, local, tribal, and academic partners, NOAA is advancing tactical firefighting decisions, improving risk management and resource planning, and increasing the understanding of the impacts of these fires on human health. In addition, this work will advance satellite-based products for fire detection. Near continuous satellite observations of fire intensity help predict rapid changes in fire behavior. These nowcasts provide firefighters with critical information before and during the early stages of a fire, at a time when intervention is most likely to change the outcome. Ultimately, NOAA will tap into our world-leading archive of historical weather and environmental data, together with modern AI techniques to predict wildfire risk and burn behavior from weather forecasts and land cover information. A new fire weather test bed will also investigate fire manager needs, improved forecast delivery, and ensure fire danger information is part of the improved forecast plan. While addressing the current drought and heat crisis a priority, the region's warming and drying trends indicate that future drought, heat, and wildfire events may be more frequent, widespread, and/or severe. It is critical that today's crisis response strengthens long-term drought resilience. Again, it will take all of us working together to develop solutions to drought and extreme heat. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Dr. Kapnick, for sharing those remarks with us today. NIDIS was established by Congress in 2006 by public law and was congressionally reauthorized twice with strong bipartisan support in 2014 and 2019. Our mission is to develop and provide a national drought early warning system, coordinate and integrate as practicable federal research in support of a drought early warning system, and build upon existing forecasting and assessment programs and partnerships. A large part of NIDIS's mission is accomplished in webinars like this. This 2022 Western Drought and Heat webinar has assembled stakeholders, decision makers, and drought experts from around the Western U.S. This is an informational webinar on drought and heat conditions and current response efforts across the Western U.S. It will include a summary of past, current, and forecasted drought conditions. We will also learn about potential and ongoing impacts from drought and the intense heat across communities and sectors. We intend for this information to be useful, timely, and actionable in supporting communities and sectors impacted by the ongoing drought. Following this webinar, please take a few minutes to provide feedback on the information you heard today. I'm now going to turn some time over to Julie Turchon, the Director of the National Integrated Heat Health Information System, our co-host for today's webinar.
Thank you very much, Amanda, and thank you to Dr. Krepnick about the introduction here. I'm Julie Turton. I am in NOAA's Climate Program Office, but in this context, I'm actually really thrilled to be leading the National Integrated Heat Health Information System along with colleagues from the Weather Service and CDC and several other agencies, as you will see along the bottom, are actually very active members in our NIHHIS Interagency Working Group. We were launched in 2015 under the auspices of the National Security Council to really address the heat and health components of infrastructure risks. And our main goal, really, our vision is that we have a nation, as you've heard, all heat deaths are really preventable. So we're trying to build a nation that is free from heat-related illness and death. A pretty simple vision, but not necessarily easy to accomplish. So we're really happy to be doing this webinar with our NIDIS colleagues, and that intersection of heat and drought is also really important. So we are set up similar to the NIDIS program with the whole focus on understanding the decision context and what decision makers need. That helps us figure out what observations and predictions and tools we need to be developing with and through our federal partners and with our state and local and tribal partners as well. So there's a whole component on co-developing the information as well as identifying the research gaps that we need to fill and better produce information. And in the end, it's really about supporting planning and response across multiple timescales. We launched NIHHIS because there was so much going on heat, even back in 2015, but it wasn't well coordinated, it wasn't well organized, and we weren't really doing a good job of addressing the cross timescale and really resilience components of it. And you'll see on that last slide there, it's really a step of an integrated information system about building capacity and communicating across levels of governance, from policy and decision makers to individual decision makers. So next slide, please. We have a few folks today on the phone, and one of our terrific new partners is Dr. Balbus from the new Office of Climate Change and Health Equity. And you might have heard some announcements from the Biden-Harris administration yesterday trying to put some resources toward helping address the heat problem in the United States, and from low energy housing income supplements for air conditioning and some longer term planning information and funds through our FEMA colleagues. So we're really excited to be having an administration that is so proactive on this issue and to be sharing information with you. And we really are looking forward to some feedback here. I'm just going to end with a couple of ideas and things that are ongoing right now. One is that we are in the middle of our heat awareness social media campaign. We're in week 1 of 5 over the summer. So it's hashtag heat safety and hashtag NIHHIS. If you, we actually have our own hashtag at NIHHIS and social media present. So if you use those, we can retweet, and please look out for the information. It's designed to really help get the federal resources out, but also make sure that everybody has the information they need to be able to take the protective action to find the information, the resources that they need. And then we are also in the middle of our summer urban heat island mapping campaigns. We have at least 14 cities this year, and for the first time we're doing 2 international communities because there's a lot of interest in how we're approaching this and learning from other countries. So I think without further ado, I just want to say thank you for joining. We're looking forward to the speakers. We've got a great lineup for you today, and we hope that the information we're presenting is helpful to you in managing heat and drought and the combination of heat and drought in the future. So Amanda, back over to you.
Great, thanks, Julie. And I also wanted to add that here at NIDIS, we really appreciate the partnership that exists between both of our integrated information systems. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started. The first session of our webinar today will be all about drought, heat, and fire conditions and forecasted outlooks. We will first hear from Dr. David Simmerall, who's from the Western Regional Climate Center, followed by Mr. John Gottschalk from the Climate Prediction Center at NOAA's National Weather Service. We will then hear from Dr. John Balbus from the Department of Health and Human Services about the current heat contacts and trends. And then a final presenter of this session will be Jim Wallman from the National Interagency Fire Center. Following these 4 speakers, we will have a few minutes for questions for the speakers, so please feel free to enter your complete question into the questions box, exactly as you would like it to be read. We will not have time to answer all questions, but we'll do a select few and read them for the panelists to answer. And now for the presentations. First up, we do have Dave Simmerall. Dave is an associate research climatologist at the Desert Research Institute in the Western Regional Climate Center in Reno, Nevada. Dave has been at DRI since 2003 and has been an author of the U.S. Drought Monitor since 2012. I'll pass it over to Dr. Simmerall.
Thanks, Amanda. Can you hear me?
Yes, and we can see everything, so you should be good.
Okay, next slide, please. Okay, getting started here, we'll take a look at the current drought conditions. As you can see on the right, this is the latest U.S. Drought Monitor map, which was released this morning. For those of you who aren't familiar with the U.S. Drought Monitor and the map, basically what you're seeing on there, the warmer colors, the warmer the color is, the more intense the drought is. So you can see we have quite a bit of drought across the Western United States. We're currently at 73% of the Western U.S. in drought, as well as 30% in the most severe categories, extreme and exceptional drought. We did have some improvements over the past several months in the northern portions of the region. As you can see, those are drought-free in some areas. Taking a look at the drought early warning systems, the DEWs, these are the different regions within NIDIS. There's a map in the upper right-hand corner of the slide. You can see where those are located. I'm not going to read through all the breakdown of the percentages per region, but you can take a look at those. Most severe in California, Nevada, and the Intermountain West. Down in the lower left, this is a time series graph of drought according to the U.S. Drought Monitor maps. So these are all the weekly maps. And you can see basically we've had the Western United States has essentially been in drought for the past 2 decades. Next slide, please. So this is looking, this is a kind of an abbreviated version of the evolution of the current drought situation. In the upper left-hand corner, this is in April of 2020. We had about 28% of the West in drought. And moving into the summer of 2020, we had some really dry conditions and poor snowpack in the Great Basin and in California as well, and areas of southern Oregon. And moving into the middle, the upper middle map is the Drought Monitor map from the same webinar last year when I presented. And at that time, we were about 90% in drought in the West. Conditions were more severe on the map and more coverage of drought. And then this is looking on the upper right, the map you just saw on the previous slide, and we've seen some improvements. Down in the bottom half, you can see these are change maps, so it's comparing different time periods. So the bottom left is 1 year ago, and you can see I've highlighted the areas where we've seen some improvements during the past year, up in the Pacific Northwest, Northern Rockies, and in the Intermountain West, and then some degradation in eastern portions of Colorado and New Mexico. Looking at the middle, bottom middle, this is looking at differences since last spring. So we've seen, again, improvements, Pacific Northwest, some areas of New Mexico, Colorado, some degradation in California. And then the last month, you can see some improvements related to monsoon season. Next slide, please. So this is a couple slides I have looking at kind of big picture. In the left-hand side, this is precipitation in the Western United States. So each of the blue asterisks represents a 3-year period from a June through July period, 3-year periods. And as you can see, this is going back all the way to the late 1800s, beginning of the observational record. Then you can see the last 3-year period has been the second driest on record. On the right, another tool we use to depict drought and detect drought is the Palmer Index. And this is a time series graph showing the percentage of the Western U.S. that's been wet or dry since 1996. And on the top are the percentage dry. And you can see we're currently at about 67%, and that's dropped over the past 3 consecutive months. You can see we're at almost hit 100%. That was last July, and that was a record on Palmer statistics. That was a record amount of the Western U.S. in extreme drought for the Western United States in the 122-year record. Next slide, please. So taking a look at the kind of some of the highlights of this past water year to date highlights. So upper left, you see these are precipitation ranking maps. So I'm going to trace this through the season. So the upper left is the fall and early winter of 2021, and we had a really great start in terms of precipitation. In the upper left, you can see I have another map on there, and that's showing landfalling atmospheric rivers in October. And we had 8 atmospheric rivers that came on shore from the Pacific during October, and those dropped really substantial amounts of snowfall and rain, primarily in the West Coast states, leading to flooding, and we had very heavy snowpack. So we were really optimistic at the beginning of the season. Right below that, as we moved into the winter, things really dried out. You know, the faucet was turned off, and during this January through March period, you can see in California and areas of, excuse me, Nevada and Southern Oregon and Southeastern Idaho, we had record dryness for that period. Moving into the spring, we had the southern half of the region really dried out. Northern half of the region was wet to kind of average conditions. And then on the bottom right, you can see those are the what it looks like for the water year. So dry in the southern half, some areas of near normal and wetter than normal to average across the northern portion. Next slide, please. So this is looking at the snowpack, and this is the snow water equivalent. And on the left this is a map from the SNOTEL network, which measures, these are our snow measurement stations across the West. So each of these areas is a drainage basin, and the number on there is the percentage of median SWE for that particular basin. You can see on April 1st, that's the big important date for water resource managers. And that's usually when the snowpack is, generally speaking, at its maximum. And you can see across most of the West, we were below normal, including in the Pacific Northwest. And during La Nina years, the Pacific Northwest is generally at above normal in terms of precip and snowpack. But you can see we had some above normal precip or snowpack in the basins in Arizona, New Mexico, and into Colorado. But moving into May, things really dried out in the southern half of the basin. And you can see that on the right, those are 3 precipitation maps looking at precipitation percentiles for March, April, and May. And you can see in April and May, all the warm colors on there, that's some record dryness in the southern portion of the region. Meanwhile, in the northern portion, in the Pacific Northwest and Northern Rockies, we had some really heavy precipitation and cooler temperatures that occurred during April and May. So normally we're looking for that miracle March. Well, this year we had the miracle April and May that really boosted the snowpack in the Pacific Northwest and Northern Rockies. Next slide, please. So something I wanted to note about the snowpack, we had an early meltout across much of the region again this season. And this has happened 3 seasons in a row. And overall, it's kind of becoming a trend in the Western United States over the past several decades due to the warming temperatures. So this year, if you look on the upper left, there's a graphic, a map there. It's the difference in disappearance date from this year's snowpack versus the average. And the warmer colors represent more days in terms of how much earlier it melted out. And you can see the southern half of the region, things really melted out quickly and early this year, up to 20 days. Look at, in particular, places like the Sierra Nevada and down in Klamath Mountains in Northern California, as well as across Southern Rockies and Wasatch. And that's related to a couple things. You can see the temperature map down below that. That's April through June. And you can see all the warm colors in the southern half of the region. And then you can see another issue in terms of the meltout was related to a number of dust on snow events. And on the right side, you can see some satellite imagery where it's pointing to some dust plumes on a particular day in May. And during those wind events, a lot of snow is deposited across the mountains, particularly in Colorado. And you can see these photos of the dust on snow. And when that dust gets on the snow, it changes the reflectivity of the surface. So when it has a darker surface, it's able to absorb more of the solar energy and melt faster. So in turn, you get a quicker melt out, and then the runoff occurs earlier. Next slide, please.
Hey, Dave, this is Amanda, just another minute or two.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so I'm gonna have to go quick here. Looking at the monsoon season, upper left, you can see we had a nice early onset to the monsoon season with above normal precip across much of the Four Corners states. You can see it in the indicators in the middle. Those are evaporative demand. So you can see, in soil moisture increase, so we had lower evaporative demand. And we also saw some improvements in the vegetation, which you can see in upper left. That's NDVI, so it's a greenness indicator. So you can see the warmer colors and represent poorer health in terms of the vegetation, and the bluer green colors represent improvements. And those match up with those areas of heaviest precipitation. Next slide, please. Moving on to the reservoir conditions, you can see across Western United States, below normal in all the states in the Western U.S. except for Washington. Above it in the upper right is where we were at the same time last year. So we've seen some degradation in some states. Even though we had a good snowpack in the Pacific Northwest, they're still slightly below normal in those states. And as previous speakers had mentioned regarding the record low, historic lows on Lake Mead and Lake Powell, you can see those are in really critically low conditions, as well as the largest reservoirs in California as well. Although we did see a slight uptick from the same time last year. New Mexico, in the Rio Grande Basin, Elephant Butte, which is their largest reservoir, really poor condition. And then the other 3 listed on there up in the Pacific Northwest, which are looking in a little better condition. Next slide, please. And just my final slide, this is just some highlights from Alaska. You can see in the upper right, these are the current drought monitor map. We have some moderate drought. It was more severe about a week ago, but we had some recent rains and cooler conditions over the past week. But a couple things I wanted to note. The next speaker from NIFC will probably talk about the fire season up in Alaska, which got off to an early start. And they've already had about 3 million acres burned. And I wanted to note the climate conditions that have helped to lead into that. In the upper left, you can see those are climate division maps, and this is a divisional precip ranking map for May and June. And you can see we had record dryness during that period in several climate divisions. And below that is the maximum temperature ranking map for the same period. And you can see we also had some record maximum temperature heat during those periods as well. And that set up some prime conditions for fire. And then the final slide, please. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Dave. Next, we'll hear from John Gottschalk. John is the Chief of the Operational Prediction Branch at the Climate Prediction Center within NOAA's National Weather Service, where he's responsible for a suite of sub-seasonal and seasonal climate outlooks and monitoring products. Prior to his current role, he served as the Climate Prediction Center's Head of Forecast Operation. On to you, John.
All right, thank you very much, Amanda, and everyone, welcome. I'm going to be, as Amanda mentioned, I'm with the National Center for Environmental Prediction, the Climate Prediction Center, just outside Washington, D.C. And I'll be giving a review of the outlooks from the shorter term out to the longer term for temperature and precipitation, and any hazards that we see in the shorter term, as well as our drought outlook and ENSO outlook moving forward. Next slide, please. So as we move into the short term for the next days, 8 to 14, or as we typically call it, the week 2 period for temperature and precipitation outlooks, temperature on the left-hand side. The main point wanted to make with this upcoming period, just before this period, which is not shown here, the 6 to 10 day period and 8 to 14 day period here, we are favoring a building ridge or upper level high pressure across much of the Pacific Northwest. And so we are favoring above normal temperatures at pretty high odds for much of the western part of the lower 48, with the highest odds across the Pacific Northwest region, Northern Rockies, with generally a weak tilt toward drier conditions as well, as you can see on the map in the upper right. As we move further south towards the southwest, as mentioned by David, the monsoon for the most part has started off well. We do expect with over the next week and moving through most of the forecast, you'll see moving forward continuations of episodic positive bursts in the monsoon, thunderstorm activity, tropical convection across much of the southern southern part of the southwest, with the monsoon cooler than normal conditions and above normal precipitation. Next slide, please. Thank you. So with respect to our week 2 U.S. hazards outlook, one of the areas I was noting previously is that we do expect the potential for some dangerous heat to impact parts of the Pacific Northwest just prior to this day's 8 to 14 period, and through much of it for the areas in the Pacific Northwest, including the cities of Portland and Seattle, with the highest threat just inland across parts of eastern Washington and eastern Oregon. And what these contours indicate are a slight risk, the outer contour for excessive heat, which is basically the upper 10% of the distribution or historical range. The moderate risk is the dotted line, which is just inland along the west coast there, of a 40% calibrated probability for that 90th percentile. And then the higher risk is a 60% of calibrated probability. So these are anchored in past retrospective data sets. And so we expect this to be a major concern potentially as we go into the week 2 period. The other area on the plot on the right is, as I mentioned, there'll be localized likely heavy rainfall associated with monsoon thunderstorms from Arizona into parts of southern Colorado during much of the week 2 period. Next slide, please. So to kind of go into a little more about what that means, what's shown on the left is the probability of the heat index or dry bulb temperature being greater than 105 degrees, with the probability being the shading. And I wanted to note that we do expect, as mentioned earlier, which will be a continuation of some of the excessive heat that we're seeing in the Southwest now in Southern California, that's likely to move up the Central Valley of California into the Pacific Northwest. And you can see some pretty high probabilities for dry bulb temperatures and heat index values being above 105 degrees in the Pacific Northwest in those regions. And the actual temperatures shown on the right are the one-day max temperatures shown, where the contours, if you look closely, you can see 195, 100, 105, even in parts of eastern Washington during this week 2 period, with this likely heat wave next week. Again, continuation from later in the week 1 period. Next slide, please. So we look further out as we go into August. This is our latest week 3 and 4 outlooks, and I want to stress this will be updated tomorrow with our latest week 3 and 4 outlook, favoring above normal temperatures, again, high probabilities for much of the West, with equal chances for the temperature category in the Southwest, mainly associated, as you can see on the right, with areas of enhanced precipitation during the 2-week period, generally drier conditions along the northern tier of the Western U.S. Next slide, please. So moving into the month of August, you'll see not too much change in what I've been talking about as far as the above normal temperatures in the western area. The highest likelihood for the upper third of the distribution of temperatures for the month, the monthly mean, is favored to be across parts of the central Great Basin, central Rockies, and then extending down towards West Texas. Precipitation-wise, we did not have very strong signals for precipitation, monthly total precipitation amounts in any one of the 3 categories. So a lot of the areas are labeled equal chances. However, again, as I mentioned, we do expect periods of enhanced monsoon activity through August. And if you move to the next slide, also during August, September, and October, with dryness across parts of the central Rockies or north central Rockies down into the parts of the central plains and central Rockies. For Alaska, favoring some above normal precipitation and across parts of the eastern part of the state. But again, noting for the left-hand plot for August, September, and October, a continuation of above normal temperatures, with the highest odds, again, mainly across the interior parts of the western lower 48 during the August, September, October 3-month mean temperatures. Next slide, please. So moving to the drought outlook, based on the information that I provided, antecedent conditions as well. The drought outlook for August, September, and October, meaning conditions at the end of October, favor a few things across the West. Obviously, for most of the brown areas, drought is expected to persist, maintain itself through much of the western United States. We do expect in the short term, the first part of this period, for some improvement, as indicated by the gray shading, as well as some removal of some areas of drought that are in lower degrees of drought in the green area for parts of Arizona and New Mexico. Most of the improvement so far has been in New Mexico, so we're hoping that there'll be some rains with respect to the monsoon over the state of Arizona as well. And later on, as we move further closer to October, over a longer time range, there is a potential for drought development in some areas of the northern Rockies, mainly Idaho and parts of far western Montana. And next slide, please. Looking at further climate conditions, more extending out in time for the ENSO outlook. As everyone's well aware, we've been in La Nina advisory to La Nina conditions for quite some time. This is expected to continue for the calendar year 2022. There may be some decrease in some of the ocean surface temperatures and probability of La Nina, as indicated by that, as we get into the late summer. But we expect those probabilities to begin to increase again as we approach the autumn and early winter months, as indicated by the blue bars on the left. The prospects for El Nino are trivial or are very minor, even at the very end of this forecast period, which is February, March, or April of 2023. So we're favoring La Nina conditions through the rest of the calendar year. And moving on to my final slide, just a quick summary. As I mentioned, above normal temperatures is the theme for the Western U.S., most likely for most of the Western United States, starting with the short term, days 8 through 14, which takes us late July into early August, with the potential for hazardous heat in the Pacific Northwest during that period as well. For August and the seasonal August, September, October period, above normal monthly and 3-month mean temperatures are most likely for the most of the region, with the highest odds in the central part of the Western United States. We do expect some improvement or favor some improvement in the monsoon region with respect to drought conditions. But as I mentioned, later on in the period, there may be some potential drought development at some of the higher latitudes in the northern Rockies later on in that 3-month period. And finally, as I just mentioned, La Niña conditions are expected and favored to remain through the calendar year 2022. So with that, I'll turn it back to you, Amanda. Thank you for your time.
Thanks, John. Next up is John Balbus. John is the Interim Director of the new Office of Climate Change and Health Equity in the Department of Health and Human Services. A physician and public health professional with over 25 years experience working on the health implications of climate change. Before coming over to the new office, Dr. Balbus served as Senior Advisor for Public Health to the Director of the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences. Over to you, John.
Great, thank you so much, Amanda, and huge thanks to you, Julian, and our NOAA colleagues here for inviting me to come in as a physician and a representative of the Department of Health and Human Service to talk about our climate and health outlook, and to highlight the really wonderful collaboration that we have with our new office, with our other parts of HHS, the CDC, and the NIH, and with our other federal partners. I'm going to be talking about this new product, which takes the forecasts that we're seeing and talking about and puts them in the context of health, data and analyses, and also resources needed for practitioners and the general public to protect their health. Just a quick disclaimer, what I'm going to be showing you today is based on the outlook that we released last week, and I'm hearing some feedback. I don't know if that's anything I can do on my end, but just making sure that you can be okay. Okay. So we are using the outlook that was released last month, but I think the point that I'll be showing is the context and the additional information that we're providing as a service to all of you who are listening. So next slide, please. Very quickly, our Office of Climate Change and Health Equity was established just less than a year ago at the end of August 2020, last year, 2021, as part of the mandates from Executive Order 14008, Tackling the Climate Crisis at Home and Abroad, which called on the Department of Health and Human Services to establish the office and also to create a new interagency working group on protecting those most vulnerable in our country from the health impacts of climate change, and a biennial healthcare system readiness advisory council. So our primary mandate really is about protecting the health of people in the face of growing climate change threats, with a strong emphasis on health equity and protecting those bearing the greatest burden of climate-related risks, who are also the very same people bearing the greatest burden of health risks overall, and also COVID risks. And so our climate health outlook is actually a part of that mission of building the resilience of people and our communities to the health impacts of climate change, because early warning system is a critical part of the overall resilience of health systems. Next slide, please. So we launched our first version of the Climate Health Outlook, and I think this was mentioned in the opening talk. The Climate Health Outlook is actually a concept that has been under development in the Global Change Research Program for a number of years, in the interagency working group that Julie co-chairs, that I've been a part of as well. But we finally were able to bring it out in May with our first edition, which was focused on heat. And this is the press release. Next slide, please. And just an acknowledgement that this concept of a seasonal forecast for health, which is what the Climate and Health Outlook represents, is not unique to the United States. The Caribbean, a coalition of the Caribbean Meteorology Institute, Meteorology and Hydrology Institute, and the Caribbean Area Regional Public Health Association and PAHO have been producing a Caribbean Health Climatic Bulletin for 5 years. Their 5-year anniversary was in March, which tries to take together all of the forecasts for heat, for precipitation, for storms, and put that into a health context. Next slide, please. And I just want to emphasize that what we are producing in the center there, the Climate and Health Outlook, is really meant to be a product that has an iterative quality improvement cycle. So if we advance once, we are collaborating with many federal agencies. We're taking the forecast from NOAA, we're taking the heat health tracker county by county heat wave forecast from CDC. We're also working with other partners, including NIHHIS, the Global Change Research Program. Next slide, advance once. Taking the forecasts that come from the Drought Information Center, from the hurricane forecasts, also the wildfire forecasts. Next slide. Overlaying that with health risk information, and some of this is information that we're generating ourselves. Some of it is partnering with other agencies in HHS and EPA. But importantly, if we go to the next advance once, again, the purpose of this is to take those forecasts that have been coming out that are of such great quality that we've been hearing about in the first two presentations, and to start interpreting them for a health audience, to tell physicians, to tell emergency rooms, to tell public health departments what they can expect over the next 30 to 90 days in terms of conditions that will impact the people living in their catchment areas. And then advance one more time. But the key here is we want this to be something that's useful and is used. We have lots of examples of products that come out of the federal government that, especially in the health sector, my experience is that a lot of health departments, a lot of physicians aren't aware or don't use them. So we hope, my hope is that everybody listening will take the opportunity to look at this if they're working in the health space, and to give us that feedback so we can make it as useful as possible. Okay, advance one more slide. So with that, let me show you what this looks like. This is the cover of our most recent Climate Health Outlook from July. This was the first time that we went beyond heat and that we also tried to provide a regional summary. So in the small illegible text there, you'll see we've used the Global Change Research Program's regionalization of the country, and we integrate the information on heat, drought, wildfire risks, and hurricane risks that are out so far. That's 4 different health risks. Over time, we hope to be able to start to incorporate other kinds of seasonal forecasts, for example, for vector-borne diseases or for pollen risks as well. And we've blown up the language there for the Southwest, which reflects what came out again last month about the number of counties that are projected to have more than 5 heat exceedance days in July, and how that relates to the drought and the wildfire risk in the region. Next slide, please. This is also a difficult to see slide, but I just wanted to emphasize that on the right there is a copy of a PDF, a downloadable PDF, a 4-page summary, which we produce because it's sometimes helpful to have something you can print and something that you can show to people and something that really summarizes. But we found very quickly that the types of information that we're trying to provide, it's too much to fit into 4 pages. So on the left side there, you see how this looks on the web. And as we are developing, we anticipate that there will be a very robust and rich web presence to be able to dive deep, hopefully dive deep all the way to the county level on this information, and be able to get that kind of actionable information online, as we also have this summary PDF that is that red outline box that you can click to download. Next slide. So we try to put the forecast into context. First of all, using the heat health tracker, which takes that the 30-day CPC product and drives it down to the not just the county level, but to information, very specific information, like which counties are looking at more than 5 extreme heat exceedance days. What we produce is a map. To get to the county level at this point, you need to go to the CDC heat health tracker site. But that's the information that we're pulling. On the bottom left there, we summarize the heat health impacts, all the health impacts of heat as an informational tool. And on the right, we are the Office of Climate Change and Health Equity. And so we highlight the risk factors that make people more vulnerable to heat. In a PDF version, we can't get down to the county level, but what we're doing there is summarizing the number of the heat exceedance counties that are in the higher quartiles or the higher levels, generally the higher quartile of population in certain risk categories. So people over 65, people without health insurance, young children, people with low education levels, et cetera, so that those of you who are working with specific populations or in public health departments can have a sense of the vulnerable populations most needed for protection. Next slide, please.
Hey, John, this is Amanda. Maybe one more minute.
Okay. In addition, what we do is provide a longer range forecast. We provide a historic spotlight. We can just switch to the next slide, advance one more slide. And one of the things that is unique about our climate health outlook is that we're incorporating some unique analyses, taking new sources of health data to be able to look at both near real time and also historical information on the health impacts county by county in the United States. So we're looking at the health impacts of heat there in rural areas on the right. And if we advance one more slide, we are also doing a look back. So that top left box is using real-time information that we're getting to be able to compare not just how is the heat different in the last 3 years, but how are the rates of heat-related illness, the average rates of emergency room presentations and hospital admissions this year, just in the last couple of months, compared to how they were in the last 3 years. So this is very, very new. We have not had the capacity to do this with health information in the United States until just very recently. And so we're trying to integrate all of these information sources, and then I've skipped over it, but we have a lot of information on the resources, not just from HHS, but from all of the federal agencies. Next slide, please. And again, also putting this in the context for hurricanes, this was a look back at the health impacts of Hurricane Harvey, trying to contextualize for emergency managers or for the meteorological community how health relates to the experience of these extreme weather events. Next slide, please. I want to acknowledge our partners in this who have helped to put this climate health outlook together. Again, they range from a number of different agencies. And let me just see the next slide. I think we may have missed a slide in here. That looks like the slide before. Okay, yeah, just in summary, again, we have the summary of the forecast that you've heard there. Our next climate health outlook, this one has the deeper dive. We still had a lot of information on heat and on hurricanes. Our next climate outlook, which we are looking to have come out at the very beginning of August, so not long from now, we'll have the updated forecasts and deep dives on drought and wildfire. Please subscribe and you will be able to get these. And even more importantly, and if we go to the last slide, please, that looks like the slide before, please take the opportunity to send us feedback. If you go to our website, it's just OCCHE @hhs.gov. The last thing I'm going to say is just to keep eyes out on the NIHHIS website. We are working across the federal government to ever improve both the communications, as Julie Turton mentioned, but also the online resources. And there will be some updated web information coming out in the very near future. And with that, I'll close. Thanks very much.
Thanks, John. Next up will be our final talk of this session will be by Mr. Jim Wallman, who is a meteorologist with the National Interagency Fire Center, or NIFC. He supports NIFC in the fire management by providing short and long-term weather information on a national scale to aid in the allocation of resources and fire planning. There you go, Jim.
All right, thank you. Good morning, everyone. I'm just going to talk about the fire outlook for the rest of the summer and into the early fall. So if you can go to the next slide, please. Just give me a quick overview of the current situation. There are quite a few fires ongoing in the west from Yosemite National Park into Utah. And we also have a larger fire with a Type 1 team on it near Salmon, Idaho at this point. There are actually 10 Type 1 and 2 incident management teams deployed. Those are teams are sent out to the most complex incidents. There are also several of those teams still stationed up in Alaska, California, like I said, the Yosemite National Park, the Great Basin, and we still have a Type 2 team on the Hermit's Peak fire in New Mexico. Next slide. And just kind of going over the overview of these outlooks. These are just generally monthly outlooks, updated every once a month, going out for 4 months. We do these in conjunction with the Climate Prediction Center, looking at their forecasts, and then use our own expertise in fire history to come up with these outlooks. Combines the current situation with the forecast, weather, and climate. And we try to talk about the total fire environment, what's going on, not only with the weather, but also the fuels. And these are really good for planning, long-term outlook planning, severity requests, resource allocations, extensions for any teams or things like that. Next slide, please. So instead of showing the monthly outlook here, I'm just going to go through the rest of the July, and a lot of this is based on the outlooks that and current situation, the drought in the West that David and John showed you earlier. So for the remainder of July, just looking at the strong high pressure above normal temperatures, much of the rest next week through the rest of this month, we're looking at moderate fire potential to continue for much of California into the Great Basin and Northern Rockies, also for portions of the inland Northwest. The Southwest monsoon will continue with generally a low risk of significant fires there. And we're also looking at potentially high risk conditions for this is a map for next Tuesday, kind of give you a general idea of the outlook there in South Central Oregon. And when we look for high risk, it's generally a greater than 20 to 25% chance of a new large fire in that area. Moderate risk is generally 5 to 15%, and that's the brown shading that you see there. When we get toward beyond this period, one thing that's going to be a concern for us with the hot temperatures is if there's any smaller scale systems that are difficult to predict in the week 2 period that can bring any potential lightning or strong wind events that could exacerbate the current conditions or contribute to new fire starts. So that's something that's going to be a concern as we get toward the end of the month and into early August. Next slide, please. So looking into August, significant fire potential across the West, much of California, Northern California, and the mountains of Southern California, we're expecting above normal potential due to long-term drought and dry fuels conditions. One thing that was mentioned earlier was the rainfall that occurred early in the winter season across Northern California really contributed to large or significant amount of grass growth in the Sacramento Valley. So valley fires are going to be concerned with the grass due to the growth there. And then continuing to the inland Northwest and portions of central Montana and also into portions of Wyoming. One thing we've also mentioned here in kind of the Great Basin, and it's a really significant concern, and also the rangelands of Southeast Oregon, because it was a wetter spring, that isn't always a good thing for lower elevation fires. The reason why is we get a significant amount of grass, and just for example, here in Boise, we're seeing a lot of the grass growth is 2 to 3 feet deep and very thick. So we're seeing above normal potential, and the lower elevations due to that grass. And now that the grass is curing out at its typical time of year during midsummer, we're starting to see a significant increase in large fires there. As for Alaska, we started off with a bang there, as you know, in June. It was the earliest one we've ever recorded 1 million acres, and that occurred on June 17th. It has continued to be very active, although the wetter pattern over the past 7 to 10 days has alleviated some concern there. However, due to the large amount of fire on the ground already and any drying events which are possible, maybe in about 2 weeks, short-term drying, there's going to be a significant commitment of resources remaining in Alaska, likely through the end of August. That's why we still have above normal significant fire potential there. And then also across the eastern plains of New Mexico, kind of tied to the southern plains drought. what's going on, just to the east side of the monsoon. It looks to we could have above normal potential there. So the next slide for September. Not much of a change across the West, really continuing above normal potential in some of the similar areas, so expanding more across Southwest Oregon, west of the Cascades in September, as we could start to see a few more offshore wind events in that time of year, and then continuing across, the northern high plains, and then across the eastern plains in New Mexico. The monsoon, though, overall is expected to keep the near normal potential across much of the greater Four Corners region into western Wyoming. Now, one thing I will mention here is just because we're forecasting normal potential doesn't mean there aren't going to be any fires. It just means that we're not going to see anything really significant as far as anything above what we would normally see this time of year, especially as you get into Utah, Nevada, Idaho. We typically do see fires, a few large fires, but during August and September, but it's not something we're going to expect a mass commitment of resources except in August over the lower elevations of the Great Basin, the Western Great Basin. And so the next slide into October. We're expecting much of the West to return to near normal potential. One thing we are watching, though, is, depending on when the monsoon wanes, is if there's going to be any heightened potential across Arizona and New Mexico, depending on the amount of grass, how quickly it cures in the fall season. But at this point, it just looks like we're going to have a normal, fall season there, which we typically do see a little bit of an increase in fire activity, but nothing, we're not expecting any huge fires like we saw 2 years ago that continued well into October. However, in California, across portions of the coast, especially in Southern California and Central California, including the Bay Area and the west slope of the Sierra, we are expecting continued above normal potential there, especially as it starts to overlap more with the offshore wind events that we can see there, Santa Ana events or Diablo east winds through the Sierra. That, how dry it is, how dry the vegetation is, not only in the timber, but also the significant grass growth in the Sacramento Valley will be a concern in October. And then next slide. So just to kind of summarize, we are seeing significant fire activity increase across much of the West over the last couple of weeks. We expect that to continue through the end of July and into August. So we're going to see above normal potential really through September, continue through September over much of California, the inland Northwest, Northern Great Basin, and then also portions of Northern High Plains. Fire activity will remain elevated near the California coast and also along the west slopes of the Sierra in October due to the increase in offshore winds overlapping the already dry conditions. And then Alaska, fire activity will continue to slow down, but like I said, we're going to continue to see a fire activity, and it will be at least an above normal resource commitment and number of fires on the ground through August, given the significant activity we have already seen in June and July. But they will start to really quiet down in September as you get to shorter day lengths and much cooler temperatures. And that's all I have. So thank you.
Great, thank you, Jim. At this time, we'll transition to a short question and answer period. I first want to thank Dave, John, and Jim for your presentations. Those were fantastic. For the speakers, feel free to turn your cameras back on if you'd like, but we just have a few minutes for questions. Just noting for folks that we will not be able to get to everyone's questions, but if you ask something, please remember to type your name and affiliation in the questions box on the GoToWebinar panel. First, I'm going to start with one question that was for John Balbus, but he had to leave the webinar here. But Julie is popped on and she's going to be able to answer it for us. So the question first is consideration of warming inland and marine waters being considered, oops, I lost it, as a large scale and long-term health risk? Are the increases in risk and spread of toxic algae, mosquito-borne diseases, and other tropical diseases? As heating of the environment occurs, people turn to water to alleviate the heat, thus exposing them to waterborne and vector-borne diseases and blue-green algae. Julie?
So Amanda, thank you for the question, and thank you to whoever asked the question. Actually, it's a really great question, and that alone could be a whole webinar. So we might want to do that as a follow-up. But here's the short version of the answer. There are many layers. One is the direct exposure and the impact on the marine and inland fisheries, and we've already seen that some. We know that for coastal fisheries, let's just take the Pacific Northwest, that the thresholds for Vibrios is 16 degrees C in coastal waters. So you either harvest if it's going to get before that point, or you lose your crop. We've already seen that. We've seen that happening in Alaska and coastal waters. We've seen die-offs from heat because of drought and then heat. They've lost some of the quahog, a tribal fishery actually. So the impacts are both on the fishery, on the culture, and on the quality and the availability of the food supply. So yes, there is actually a very important component of drought and heat and fisheries, either inland or marine. And you add on top of that the role of heat in eutrophication and increasing of harmful algal blooms, both in the coastal environment, creating opportunities for fish kill, as well as cyanobacteria in inland waters, on the food supply, but also on direct exposure, dogs swimming in golf course ponds, that kind of thing, your kids, that kind of stuff. So there is an increased risk just with that. And then there was another component you asked about, people reducing water and exposing to waterborne and vector-borne disease. Vector-borne diseases, mosquito-borne and sand and fleet, other diseases that are definitely related to the environment and ecosystem, soil moisture, ground cover, human interaction with the ecosystem. There are all kinds of factors related to how people are exposed to various vector-borne diseases that are absolutely affected by heat and drought individually and together. And that's why, John, in the presentation, the outlook, the climate health outlook, it's really hard to figure out how to communicate the vector-borne disease risk because it's very complicated and also very site-specific. So yes, there are impacts. They are direct impacts. Their impact on the food supply, their impact on actual transmission rates, and they are also moderated by our human interaction and our own immune status and vulnerability to them. So it's a really complicated question and a really good one, and one that we hope to be able to address more clearly, but it's still really complicated to put in a bulletin that puts out there. So thank you so much for the question. And I'm glad to know that you're thinking about that, because it really is a problem. And it definitely requires a concerted collective effort to address properly at the much more local scale where the impacts are really felt. So thank you. And I hope that helps.
Thanks, Julie, for stepping in for John there with that great answer. I'm going to move on to the next question to keep us going, and this one's for Dave. The first speaker, who'd be you, Dave, said something about the effect of we're in the worst drought in 1,200 years. Can you explain more about that?
Yeah, this is based on comparing paleo data from many years ago. So obviously we're not looking at all the same indicators, but yeah, there's been periods of intense drought that have been occurring through the millennia, but all the indicators are showing now that the current drought is one of the most severe in the last several thousand years. And at this point, looking at projections and so forth, it's not looking like the situation is going to change in the near future. And as you can see, if the past 2 decades plus is any indicator of what's ahead, yeah, I mean, it's looking like we are in the middle of a mega drought, and the situation could possibly be continuing for some time into the near future.
Great, thanks, Dave. This one's another one for you about a specific slide you had. On the slide, drought evolution, why was April of 2020 shown instead of July, like in the 2021 and 2022 maps?
Can you repeat that one more time? I'm just pulling up the slide.
It's scrolled by itself. Why was April of 2020 shown instead of July, like in 2021 and 2022 maps?
Yeah, I chose that because that's a critical time at the beginning of April when we're looking at the snowpack and the implications moving forward. So that was a critical time when things started. After that April 7th map, the next Drought Monitor map, things started to ramp up quite a bit as we were able to see what the snowpack, was going to be looking like moving into the summer months. And we had really poor conditions in California, in the Great Basin, and areas like in the Southern Cascades as well, in those basins. And moving into those summer months, as I mentioned, we had all that record heat, and we had record dry conditions across the Four Corners states in terms of the monsoon season. So basically, this was just to give an idea of what conditions were like coming out of the cool season in the 2019-2020 and moving into the summer months when things really started to ramp up.
Great, thanks, Dave. And then this one is for Jim. Can you please talk a little bit more about the types of wildfire decisions that are made at the different time scales of the Outlook products that you showed, i.e. a month to several months ahead? Thank you. Maybe we lost Jim. I think Jim had to hop off. He was a little tight for time, given some of the responsibilities they have. I will move back then real quick to a Dave question, and maybe some of the other speakers as well. For Dave, is normal, in quotes, used by most speakers compared to the last 30 years? And if so, could anyone speak to the shifting baseline issue? Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, the normals period, normal is defined as the period in which, generally speaking, in a number of the indicators that we use, for example, the SNOTEL SWE data, we look at the last 30-year period, or the last 30-year period, or 20-year period, depending on some of the data products we're looking at. So those get updated. Often, though, you're seeing us using percentile rankings, and that's a little bit different. So we're looking at the entire period of record. So that depends on the data set. For satellite data, that can be perhaps about 30 years. Looking at some of the precip data, like in the slides I gave you on the third slide, looking at the 3-year periods and so forth, that's going back all the way into the late 1800s. And yeah, there's differences when you change that normals period, which the normals period just updated 30-year normals for a variety of products like the SNOTEL data. That does make a difference in terms of calculating anomalies from the normal. So when you update, for example, we've had drier periods during the past 30 years, that changes the anomalies. So you're going to see that average period is going to shift. So the data is going to look a little different. And we are having current discussions within the drought and climate community regarding usage of the latest normals period versus using the period of record. So that's a topic that's being talked about presently within the drought community.
Great, thanks, Dave, and thanks to all our speakers. Sorry to those who couldn't get to your questions. I hear there's a lot of great questions in the questions box, but obviously we're a little short on time. With that, we're going to move to the next half of our agenda. There we'll look at the West-wide drought and heat perspectives from the field. So we're going to hear about diverse drought and heat impacts from some communities and sectors across the West, and about the experience of those who are working to respond and cope with the current conditions. To start off, we're first going to go to David Handula. David Handula is the Director of Heat Response and Mitigation for the City of Phoenix, Arizona. In that role, he helps lead and coordinate programs that aim to protect people from dangerous summer heat and and implement strategies to cool the city and make it more comfortable. He joined the city of Phoenix in October 2021 to spearhead the nation's first publicly funded municipal office of heat response and mitigation. On to you, David.
Good morning, everyone from Phoenix, and thanks, Amanda, for the warm introduction. I'll just check that you can see and hear me okay.
Yes, perfectly.
Fantastic, thanks. So happy to share an update on our experience in Phoenix thus far this summer. And John, I really appreciated hearing your 2-week outlook that we have some below average temperatures in the forecast for next week. It's been a really tough stretch here for the past 2 or 3 weeks, so the cool weather is appreciated. Thank you for arranging for it. We can go to the next slide, and I'll just start by giving a high-level sense, and please click in the 4 or 5 animations. Part of our experience with heat in the Southwest is that it is literally changing how we are doing business as local government. In last year's city budget here in Phoenix, there was a new investment in climate and heat that included additional funding for tree planting, update for tree inventory, some staff for water conservation, and in our parks department. But the part that I represent is, as was mentioned, our nation's first publicly funded office in local government focused on heat. We are 9 months on the job, and it has been a tremendous learning experience thus far, and happy to share a little bit of what we've been learning with this audience so far. We can go to the next slide. We have put together some principles, or initial principles of how we should work and what we might do, and I won't go through all these in great detail, but just for a couple high-level points. We understand our charge to be thinking not only about short-term strategies that can help protect people when it's hot in the summer, but also long-term strategies that can help cool the city and improve quality of life over the long term. We certainly do not operate in a silo. The way we're set up structurally, we have to coordinate with all the other city departments, particularly the ones that play leadership roles on these initiatives. Like, for example, tree planting is largely done by our Parks and Streets department. So I see our role as one of coordination, one looking for synergies, one looking to take advantage of missed opportunities. We can go ahead to the next slide and bring in the other 4 points, and we're happy to talk about any of these in greater detail, of course. An interesting balance that maybe interesting, but a balance I'm trying to find is taking advantage of so much previous research, so much previous community input, so many previous plans. There's already a ton of information about what we can and should be doing versus continuing to be on the leading edge of looking for new data, think about facilitating new studies. What do we need to do to be even more precise? Trying to find that balance has been part of the learning experience over the past 9 months. We're certainly trying to center equity in our work, focusing on the most impacted populations and the historically underserved neighborhoods. We can click ahead, please. Thanks, Amanda. One of the tasks that our office has completed in the first 9 months was writing the city's first heat response plan with many other city departments. This was an operational planning document for summer 22, and it had 3 goals: to see a reduction in heat-associated deaths and illnesses, and then very importantly, at the end of this season, to try to evaluate each of the now what we understand to be 31 different programs and services related to heat that the city is involved with in some way. One of the parts of the plan on the next slide was trying to improve our situational awareness. Thank you. John, we've been using graphics from your team in a new weekly heat report that's distributed to city leadership and other partners in the region. We're trying to look at the weather data, looking at health data, looking at community inquiry data to try to shape the messaging we're putting out to the public and try to shape what we're doing on a day-to-day basis. An example of how we're trying to look at data is on the next slide. The city deploys heat relief outreach teams. Oh, I'm sorry, let me give you a situational awareness, what we're seeing thus far this season. One of the data streams we are looking at is calls to the Phoenix Fire Department that appear to be heat related, and unfortunately this year we are above the pace from last year. We were tracking slightly below until this really tough stretch we've had in mid-July. We're now approaching 10% above where we were last year. Even more encouragement to keep trying to do more and be smarter about the work that we're doing. We're also looking at these data spatially on the next slide, and none of us will be able to see the details here, but just to give a sense that there are some hot spots where we're able to focus our efforts. And what those efforts are on the next slide include direct heat relief outreach teams, some of which the city deploys, others of which community groups are deploying, who we are trying to help support. We're looking at those hotspots. We're looking at other reports to understand where to go to get heat relief supplies out in the community, to share information about where public cooling resources are, and really critically, with our professional case managers, try to get folks connected to other services like shelter, housing, ID, food stamps, where we can do so. Those are, of course, the really big wins that we're after that we think will improve the resilience of the region. It is a long game. It is we're fighting for many small wins that we hope will be accumulating up to larger wins. But a lot of learning for me, especially first 9 months as part of this effort. Just a couple more slides. Thanks, Amanda. We can click forward. Just to share a couple of other pieces, I think there's one more animation here, thanks. Just a couple other pieces of the pie here in Phoenix that we might think about interfacing with some of our national data streams. There are some rules in place in our jurisdiction about home cooling. In the city of Phoenix in particular, there are rules about how cool rental units must be able to, how cool rental units must be. The temperature threshold varies by cooling system. The city will take action if there is non-compliance. There was a change in state level policy about when utilities are allowed to shut off people's power last year. This is the first full summer we've had that change in effect. And there are different rules for different utilities. So the city is trying to help message to be sure that folks understand who their provider is and what the rules are that apply to them. And we were able to secure some additional American Rescue Plan Act funding to help expand our weatherization program, not only to reach more homes, but to use different tools in the toolbox than the traditional federal weatherization program allows, which we think can be quite impactful. And we'll be rolling out those efforts later this year. I think there's just one more slide, Amanda. Yes, just a note, since we're talking about drought, I wanted to highlight that we will be updating the city's tree and shade master plan, which was last written in 2010. So it's been sitting there for a long time. How we're funding urban forestry, who's involved in urban forestry, what our goals are have really evolved over the past 12 years. So an update to this document is sorely needed. And of course, a critical question that everyone is asking as we think about an update to the tree and shade master plan is how are you going to solve the water piece of the puzzle? So we plan to have a much more sophisticated approach to looking at the water resources required to support urban forestry and much clearer guidance about how we think we can move forward on our urban forestry goals without affecting regional water sustainability in any adverse way. With that, I will pause and thank you for the chance to share a little bit of our experience in Phoenix. It's an honor to be here with this group. Certainly looking forward to discussion down the road. Thank you.
Great, thank you, David. And just a reminder to folks, you can start putting your questions already in the question box for our panelists as we move through them here. Next, we'll hear from Dr. Michael Kotutwa Johnson, the Assistant Specialist in Indigenous Resilience at the School of Natural Resources and the Environment at the University of Arizona. Dr. Michael Kotutwa Johnson is also a 250th generation Hopi dry farmer. He will talk to us about the impacts of drought on tribal communities in the Colorado River Basin, and we'll also touch a little bit about indigenous traditional ecological knowledge. I'll pass it on to you, Dr. Johnson.
Yeah, so thanks for everybody for having me today here. I used to also be a former district conservationist on the Hopi Reservation for the Natural Resource Conservation Service. So a lot of my work kind of focuses on and tailors into what I'm doing today. I am a traditional farmer. I've been farming, our people have been farming here for over 3,000 years, and I'm what I call the 250th generation Hopi dry farmer. And so just glad to be here today. So that's just simply the title of my presentation. I'm having a little bit trouble of seeing the whole thing here, but tribal waters in the Southwest, impacts and solutions. So go ahead, next slide. So right now we have about 30 tribes in the Colorado River Basin, both lower and upper. They have all different cultures, all different needs and everything else like that. Our most immediate concern is the 2 to 4 million acre foot cutback that the Bureau of Land Management is issuing. And so we're just trying to scramble around to see where we fit into that component. Unfortunately, a lot of the laws that were made out there in the Colorado River Basin really didn't have any discussion with tribes. And so we're just trying to figure out ways that we can have positive input and move forward. Okay, next. Okay, right now, with these challenging solutions to the climatic factors that are reaching us, it's not something new. A lot of these things are just been exacerbated through things like COVID, but also especially the drought. We've always had these issues. It's just a matter of talking to them more about those. So, first of all, some of the barriers are this lack of adequate financial and human capital, basically technical assistance to address issues like water and agricultural infrastructure. One of the reasons we don't use our water that much, or sometimes we have some of these old systems, is that we were promised new ones and nobody's ever delivered on that. And so as a result of that, sometimes you have like up to like 40% or 60% of the Navajo Nation who doesn't have clean access to drinking water. And so those things need to be corrected, okay? And so there's also this lack of data related to natural resources. For example, there's very few weather stations that I know of in the Southwest on these 30 tribal reservations. I think we have one out here that's supposed to be in charge of 1.6 million acres. And so we're trying to have the infrastructure put in place. Every time I talk, there's always been talk about we'll have citizen science do that, but we don't even have the infrastructure to take our data and put it down on a computer to actually get to where it needs to go. Also, there's this lack of tribal engagement in the acre water management, and I don't know if the tribes are being engaged at all right now as far as this 2 to 4 million acre feet cut down. And so that's very interesting, but it's something that it's a policy question and also a political one that we all need to work with. But some of the solutions on the bright side is that, the federal allocations to address capital improvements using funding mechanisms such as the Farm Bill, there are going to be more stuff coming down the pipe. There's the infrastructure plans that have been made available to tribes. The things that we lack are what they call good shovel-ready projects. We lack shovel-ready projects to take full advantage of these funds. Okay. Also, there's this regionally established databases for tribal natural resource and agricultural data. That's something that I'm working for at the Indigenous Resilience Center to try to house some of this data. There seems to be data out there in some cases for Indian tribes to make key decisions on what they could do with climatic factors, but a lot of that's just spread out through agency. There's no one place where tribes can go to get this data. They have to go from place to place in order to find that, which becomes a real barrier for implementing projects. Also, one of the other solutions is this collaborative partnerships involving local, state, and also nonprofit organizations. It seems to me like a lot of tribes are still relying upon the federal government to do a lot of our work, but there are a lot of organizations like the Environmental Defense Fund and the Nature Conservancy that love to help tribes, but they don't know help. And some of my work at the IRC, Indigenous Resilience Center, will be able to form those partnerships so that we're all better to get along and work together. So go ahead, next slide. So when I want to talk about, the lack of climate thing. So here's an example of that. The lack of weather stations. You can also look at the tribal NRC, Natural Resource Conservation Service Tribal Climate Analysis Network. You can see there in the Southwest, there's only 2 of those. Those look at soil moisture, something that's vitally needed, especially out here on where we do farm. We don't have the criteria nor the data in order to do that. And so I'm sure if you put a NOAA map over the reservation boundaries, you'd see a lot of black holes. And so I know that NOAA is diligently trying to work with that problem, and I'm sure that they're doing a good job, but I just hope everything's followed through and there's funding. For example, we have the Native American or the American Indian Natural Resource Management Act, which calls for Indian agricultural resource management plans. That was done in 1993. That would allow us to put conservation on the ground the way we would like to put it on the ground, in basically an environmentally friendly manner, but that thing has never been funded. 1993 has never been funded. And so we're trying to get some of those things back into the Farm Bill, and maybe we can find a source of funding that would allow us to move forward. So that's just an example of what I mean by lack of data. So next. So Indigenous traditional ecological knowledge, I like to call it ways of knowing. Up here at Hopi, we have a very unique system, a 3,000-year-old system where we don't irrigate. First of all, it's place-based. We've always been doing that, so all of our techniques are designed to conserve soil moisture. You can see the drought that plant's going through, but look at the plant itself. That's just 3,000 years of resiliency, 3,000 years of ways of knowing, showing how to use moisture to its soil full potential, and also raising those seeds that come out of that. So in my mind, we should be trying to reinforce these systems that are already out there. That 80% of global biodiversity is only on 25% of the land that's managed by only 5% of the population, which happens to be indigenous. Also, replication is important. As a scientist, replication is important. You can't argue with anywhere from 3,000 to 10,000 years of replication. The Office of Science and Technology Policy is trying to incorporate traditional ecological knowledge into federal guidelines to help with this, to actually reinforce this thing. It's a good thing. Also, our traditional ecological knowledge is biodiverse inclusive. There's a lot of biodiversity with that. It's environmentally friendly. That's been time tested. Very cost effective. It doesn't cost that much to do the things we need to do, but we need to have a way to upscale this. And also brings upon something that nobody ever seems to talk about when it comes to things like regenerative agriculture, the human well-being aspect of what we do as indigenous communities here in the United States and throughout the globe. And so that thing needs to be going. And I'm kind of writing a paper on that right now. So go ahead and next slide, please. So indigenous regenerative agriculture, I kind of have another definition right there. I can't really see it on my screen, but I'm attempting to refine this because the current definition of regenerative agriculture, as much as it's well meant to be, and as much as it's being associated with indigenous people, I want to redefine the definition so it has some sort of value on it. You know, unfortunately, we talk like we're talking about water today as a commodity, you know, rather than something that has value. And there's a big difference in that, and in the fact that if you don't have a respect or a value for something, it tends to not mean anything. And so turning on your tap is simply a commodity, a result of commodification. And so that's just my own philosophical statement, but that's kind of where I'm at on that on indigenous regenerative agriculture. Go ahead, pop it. Next slide. So in the summary, here are some of the great resources. There's a good plan by the Native American Agriculture Fund, my former organization, that outlines the infrastructure needed to help things. And when we put in these infrastructures, we'll also be able to help with climate change, things like food hubs, process centers, things that create incentives. And when I mean incentives, you know, when you have examples of the Navajo Nation, for example, where a lot of their dust comes off of their reservation and gets on the Colorado Plateau, there's no incentive for them to change their management practice. There's no processing center there. There's no reason for them to manage their cattle in the wrong way other than that they own degradation of their land, but they need something a little bit more that would allow them to enable to see the value in that, and so that we would be able to solve some of those overflow problems. You know, federally recognized tribal extension officers, another underfunded program that for me needs to be really funded. It's only funded maybe a fourth of what it's supposed to be. That's to have agents on Indian reservations so that we're able to deal with climate situations and actually to tell people about our barriers. If we don't have anybody out there, nobody knows about it. The status of tribes report that just came out on the press is a very good one. That talks about our climate situation on our Indian country in America. I'm happen to be a co-author of the Indigenous chapter on climate assessment number 5, and so it's very important that we have our voices heard. And meetings like this are very good at doing that. I appreciate being allowed to come here. And then this climate resilient water, that's another documentation that the University of Nevada put out as far as some of the situations that we face with water shortages and climate drought problems that we have overall. And so that's pretty much the end of my talk. And any questions, I look forward to getting those at the end of the panel. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Johnson. With that, we'll move on to our next speaker. But first, I'll say a lot of these resources you just shared, we need to pop them over into the chat as we have for a lot of the other speakers, but these ones in particular are over there right now. With that, our next presentation will be Tom Ballard, the Senior Hydrologist of the Resource Development Unit at the California Rural Water Association. Mr. Ballard has a wealth of experience as a consulting hydrogeologist focused on the development of groundwater resources and the troubleshooting of municipal water supply wells, including diagnostics for chemical, microbiological, and physical issues. Over to you, Tom.
Okay, I'm sorry, my camera is, well, there's a, I'm not sure where the oh, wait a minute, there we go.
Yeah, we see like a little symbol right now and something else. I'm not sure if it's working.
Yeah, that's fine. I'll just turn my camera off, and you don't get to see my beautiful face. So, okay. So this is we're going to talk about mainly focused on California. I'm a hydrogeologist with the California Rural Water Association. I'm also a consultant, and so we work on a lot of water supply. I'm the groundwater guy, so I'm mainly going to talk about groundwater here. So next slide, if we could. And this is one that you're probably sick of seeing it at this point. This is last week's drought Drought Monitor. And, you know, kudos to NOAA. This is a great resource that I look at all the time. Now, groundwater is an interesting thing because the precipitation and the drought it's not a one-to-one correlation with groundwater storage and water levels. It takes a while when a drop of precipitation hits the ground, the shallow aquifers, it can take years for it to get down there. If you got a deeper aquifer, it can take hundreds of years or thousands of years. So there's really a delayed response that we see, and it's complicated by a number of factors that we'll get into here. But let's just look at some historical droughts for comparison purposes. So next slide, please. And we just go back and I think you know, the 1930s there, huge drought. That was the Dust Bowl years, Grapes of Wrath. And we saw, I think our first presenter showed on the graphs, you know, how bad things really got during those years. But we've had some cyclical droughts, 50s and the 1810s affected more the Midwest. The 1930s, the 1860s hit the West and the Midwest as well. So there's some cyclical droughts. These all affect groundwater, but what we and next slide, please. What we really got to look at is when we're talking about drought impacts to groundwater in California, we can't really separate surface water supplies from groundwater supplies, and so they flip-flop back and forth. Next slide, please. And so we have a double whammy when it comes to groundwater. So the precipitation obviously takes a while to impact the groundwater, recharge the groundwater, but it does immediately impact surface water supplies. So as surface water deliveries, especially to farmers in the Central Valley, go down, they increasingly turn to groundwater. So we are not getting the precipitation during a drought that's going to eventually recharge the aquifers, but at the same time, we have agriculture going out there and drilling more wells and tapping into the groundwater. So we have more water coming out of the ground than we have going into the ground. So we have overdrafted basins. Now the state has done some things to fix that. It's a long-term solution. It's not going to happen right away, but let's look at some of the effects here. So next slide, please. This is, and as I was shuffling my slides, making some late changes, I mislabeled this a little bit. This is actually groundwater storage in the Central Valley area. And if you look at Sacramento Valley, San Joaquin Basin, and Tulare Basin, that's north to south divisions of the Central Valley. And then the axis on the left there is millions of acre feet, so depletion. So this is 1925 to 2016. And you can see that the trend is not good in all these areas. Tulare Basin is horrible. We're looking at depletion of a change in groundwater storage of 140 million acre feet of water. That is a lot of water. So an acre feet, for people don't know, is an acre of land with 1 foot of water on it. So a million acre feet would cover the city of Phoenix completely in water 3 feet deep, for instance. So that's how much water we're talking about here. Huge changes in storage, and this basically comes from pumping more water than is going back into the ground. So we see some effects from that. Next slide, please. And one of the big effects here is subsidence. And this is one monitoring station that's tracked by the USGS, but it's illustrative of our purposes here. This goes from 2004 to 2015. And sorry about these. It's really hard to get this stuff up to the minute. So if there's a question on that, it's just that it takes a while to analyze and plot the data up. So sometimes you're going back, 5 years or so to get the most recent plots of these data that's been analyzed and stuff. So that's really what we're looking at here. So what we're seeing pretty much, I mean, it's not a one-to-one correlation, but pretty darn close, of groundwater levels versus subsidence going on. And subsidence is a huge deal. When you get subsidence going on, what happens is the aquifer, you're pumping more water out than is going back in, so you're depleting that aquifer. The aquifer itself, speaking geologically, is supported by a mineral skeleton that kind of keeps that. It's almost like a sponge, but kind of a fragile sponge. You can't squeeze it, it'll bounce back. What happens is once you collapse that aquifer down from subsidence, you do not get it back 100%. You're basically, that storage is going to be gone for forever, or nearly forever. And so you're going to lose a lot of capacity to recharge that aquifer from subsidence. You crush it down, you can't get all the water back in there that you had before. So subsidence is really a huge deal, because we're talking about the future of our groundwater here. So this is one station. Let's look at a bigger area. So next slide, please. This is San Joaquin Valley subsidence. So this is the southern part of the Central Valley. You can see Merced, Fresno, Visalia, Delano, Bakersfield. Bakersfield is getting down into the Tulare area. So this is 1949 to 2005 subsidence. You can see we have some areas in there that are subsiding 20 feet or more. And so this is obviously, when you're talking 20 feet of subsidence, you're talking about not only crushing down that aquifer so that you can't restore that groundwater storage, but you're also talking about billions of damage to infrastructure. We're talking buildings, we're talking canals, we're talking highways. You're seeing that showing up there as the ground subsides. You don't just collapse the ground down 20 feet and expect that everything's just going to move with it and there not to be damage. And they have accumulated some numbers that run into the billions of dollars of damage to infrastructure that subsidence is causing. So it's a huge deal. So let's focus in right now on that area that in Lemoore there, that kind of big blob in the center where it's got that purple core. And this is, I plotted up on the Sigma water viewer. This is a contour showing groundwater elevation change in the spring when water levels should be their highest, from 2011 to 2021. And you can see in this area here, kind of in the southwestern portion of this particular map, we're talking almost 300 feet of groundwater level drop in 10 years. That is huge. And so what we're seeing is, and we don't have time to dive into this, but you can actually plot up the number of wells that have gone dry because of this. And the thing is, a lot of these shallower wells that are getting hit with this are basically going to be domestic wells, maybe small water systems. We've got some small communities in the Central Valley where the entire town has gone dry. All their wells have gone dry. They don't have water. They have to truck in water because of these declining water levels. So huge deal. So what are we doing about this? Let's move on to the next slide. We have Governor Newsom issued on March 28th, he issued drought Executive Order N-7-22. It addresses a number of emergency drought requirements, conservation requirements, some of the usual stuff. But groundwater was mainly impacted through Section 9. So let's see what's in that section. Next slide, please. So basically, Section 9 is divided into paragraph A and B, and paragraph A says there's no new permits for wells under the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, which is California's program that was implemented in 2014, I believe, to create sustainability in high priority basins, overdrafted basins, essentially in the state. these the sustainability is done through groundwater sustainability plans that are managed by groundwater sustainability agencies within each basin. So a lot of acronyms there, but that's basically what that is. So no new wells unless they're shown to be consistent with these groundwater sustainability plans, and they will not decrease the likelihood of achieving sustainability goal for the basin. So kind of a high bar here for new wells. Next slide, please.
Hey, Tom, this is
Paragraph
Amanda.
B.
1 more minute.
Excuse me?
Maybe 1 more minute, Tom. This is Amanda. Just wrap it up soon. Thank you.
Sure. I can get it done. So no new wells without looking at interference with existing wells or not likely to cause subsidence. These are challenging requirements. Next slide, please. Now, these don't apply to domestic wells and public water systems, so mainly focused on agricultural wells. But, and my final slide here is a lot of water permitting agencies, which are mainly the counties, are suspending or limiting permits for all new wells and applying the Section 9B provisions to all wells, not just ag wells. So we're really seeing an uproar because we're not allowing many new wells in some areas of the state. So it at a minimum, it increases the cost and time frame of new wells significantly. So it's really slowing down, putting more straws in the drinking water glass, as it were. So that's last slide is just kind of my wrap up. So we will see if this works. There's a lot of other measures we can take here, but they take time. Groundwater is a slow process to manage. So thank you very much for listening. Hopefully you got some good information out of that. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Tom. With that, we'll move on to our last speaker before question and answer. Our last speaker is economist Clay Palmer with the Western Area Power Administration's Colorado River Storage Project Office. Clayton also teaches economics and statistics at Weber State University and Salt Lake Community College. He's written journal articles and reports on hydropower and has been involved in studies on the future of the Colorado River Storage Project. He is currently working with Argonne National Labs and NREL on developing models to determine how drought and additional renewables will affect the marketing of federal hydropower. Over to you, Clayton.
Thanks. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So I've noticed that I have little time and much to say. So I'm going to ask the person running the slides to be quick. So go, yes. So I'm going to be talking about hydropower dams on the upper Colorado River Basin. That's above the Lee Ferry Gauge in northern Arizona. So the biggest one is Glen Canyon. Skip to the next. A tenth the size of Glen Canyon is Flaming Gorge on the Green River in Wyoming. Skip to the next. And then there are 3 large dams in Colorado. These total a capacity of 1,700 megawatts. These are small. This power is small relative to the Western United States. For example, managed under the California Independent System Operator is 50,000 megawatts. And I'm talking about 1,700 megawatts. So this power system is small relative to the Western United States. Nevertheless, in a minute, I'm going to argue that it's important in a local area. Next slide. So there is the area in which people get Colorado River Storage Project power. These are the service areas for the customers we sell power to. Under the law, we're required to sell power to non-profit organizations, so we don't sell power to people who serve electricity to Denver or Salt Lake City or Phoenix or Albuquerque. For the most part, we're delivering power to rural areas and to Native American tribal reservations. Secondly, we're a wholesaler. We don't fill the power requirements fully, 100% of those folks who are customers. We deliver about 20% of their electrical power needs on average. That's not true for tribal resources. We deliver quite a bit more power to tribes who are utilities. In fact, the Navajo Nation, for example, gets almost all of its power from Colorado River Storage Project. However, hydropower has no fuel costs, so it's inexpensive, and we provide a flexible arrangement so our customers can take their power according to their needs. So the degree of importance of the Colorado River Storage Project hydropower is higher than the percentage that we deliver to them. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. Okay, so I'm presuming that people listening in here are familiar with the fact that there's a drought. So what I'm doing here is showing the elevation of Lake Powell over time. This begins with when it was first closed in 1963 and goes along. The year 2000 is a set of peaks right there toward the middle right. Since the year 2000, the elevation of Lake Powell has significantly dropped. One thing I want to say about this is that Lake Powell and the other Crisp dams were built for water storage, not for power. Power is a component. So these, the elevation drop in Lake Powell is a function both of the drought and its requirement to deliver water to the lower basin, to Lake Mead. The pipes for delivering water through the power plant are in the middle of the dam. And so I've also marked where the minimum power pool is here. I have yet to know why engineers who design dams put the pipes that deliver water to the power plant in the middle of the dam instead of at the bottom of the dam. But that's another subject and I don't have an answer. Next slide, please. This means two things. This drop in elevation means two things. It means something different for power than it means for water, because hydropower is generated based on not only the water that goes through the turbines, but also the hydrologic head. So the higher the head, the more efficient it is. At full pool, at 3,700 feet above, average above sea level, it takes 1.9 acre feet to produce a megawatt hour. Currently, at the elevation that Lake Powell sits today, it takes 2.74 acre feet to produce the same unit. So more water is required to produce a megawatt hour now because of the lower hydro head. The second thing that's worrisome to us is the potential loss of power completely if the lake drops below the intake structures, the tubes that deliver the water to the power plant. So the Bureau of Reclamation currently is engaged in extraordinary measures to try to keep Lake Powell's elevation above 3,490, which is where the pipes are. And we at Western Area Power Administration work with our customers to figure out replacement if that becomes necessary. Next slide. I'm going to go quickly through this. Basically, I need to explain that we provide a firm product. So we have contracts where we have to deliver. Next slide. And under the law that established the Colorado River Storage Project facilities, under the law, we have a bank account. It's a bank account in the U.S. Treasury, but it's a bank account. We don't get money from Congress. We sell power, put it into the bank account, and then expense everything out of that bank account. So, next slide. What that means is it means that when we looked at the summer of 2021, as the economy started to recover from COVID, people went back to work, electrical demand rose considerably, and because of supply chain problems, the price of electricity on the market grew considerably. If we don't have the hydropower we need, we have to buy it from the market because we've got commitments under contract. In the summer of 2021, because of the high price of electrical power and low hydropower production, we were looking at dropping our bank account to zero, having no money, no way to deliver power above generation. And so we took an extraordinary measure, which is we asked our customers to drop their take of crisp power. I want to show you in this slide the difference between by month, between capacity that's in the contract that customers have and what we're able, which is the blue line, and what we're able to actually produce using the crisp units in the green line. The customers have had to buy their own power or generate their own power to make up the difference. And this has burdened our firm electric service customers significantly, consequentially, and surprisingly in just recent years, because this drop in power in Lake Powell and this increase in price for electrical power happened rather suddenly. So this is a significant and sudden financial burden to people who get crisp power. Next slide. I'm going to talk a little bit about the drought. People on this phone call, panelists on this panel, know a lot more about it than I do. I'm going to try to narrow down the issue to just hydropower related problems. Here's, by the way, a picture of the back of Glen Canyon Dam. You can see the drop in hydrological head here, the drop in Lake Powell elevation. In 1984, 1985, people were worried that water was going to spill over the top of the dam. So that's so this picture illustrates that drop in elevation. Next slide. So this is a complicated thing. The question is, okay, so it's dry. What do we know about dry? Is this short term? Is this a drought, and we're gonna get back to average conditions? This is a data display based on based on work by a hydrologist, a climate scientist by the name of Connie Woodhouse, who researches out of Arizona State University in Tucson. She took every year, and on the x-axis she took how much water fell as snow or rain, but how much water fell on average through the upper Colorado River Basin in terms of millimeters per square meter. And on the y-axis is what water passed by the Lee Ferry gauge. And I told you the Lee Ferry gauge is the split between the upper Colorado River Basin and the lower Colorado River Basin. It's a narrow little canal where all the water from the upper basin goes and funnels through to the lower basin. And the blue dots are the years 1906 to 1987, and the red dots are 1987 to 2012. And what this says is, it says in later decades, in the latest 30 years or so, we can get water. It can fall as snow and rain, and we can have precipitation like we've had precipitation in the past, but less of it gets into the river. So she attributes this to an increase in average ambient temperature in the upper Colorado River Basin. Next slide.
Clayton,
So,
if you could wrap up, that'd be great. Thank you.
yeah. So the conclusion of that is that that if it's not just a drought, if it's not, we haven't seen water for a while, oh well, things happen, it's cyclical. The conclusion, if the conclusion is that this is a systematic change, that air temperatures have risen, because air temperatures have risen, the snow that falls and the water that's in it evaporates to a greater extent, or is taken up by drier soils or by drier plants, then this is not something that's going to change in the future, regardless of a change in the weather or a change in the precipitation. In water year 2021, according to those folks who study this, 19% of the reduction in runoff was not because of a lack of water, but because higher temperatures caused the water that fell as snow to cause less of it to get into the river. Next slide. That's it. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much. At this time, we're a little behind, we're at the end. For those who want to stick around, I do have a question for each of our panelists here. I first want to say thank you to David, Michael, Tom, and Clayton for sharing your presentations and things like that. With that, I'll move on to questions before wrapping up. Yes, feel free to bring your camera on if you'd like as a speaker. First one goes to David, if you're still there. In Phoenix, are there plans to work with the urban arm of the Forest Service Forest Inventory and Analysis Program?
Hi, everyone. Yeah, the answer is yes. I'm not immersed in the day-to-day urban forestry conversation. In fact, our regional urban forestry roundtable meeting just wrapped up moments ago. But we do work very closely with the State Forestry Association, which is connected to federal efforts as well. And certainly doing as much as we can to get a better picture of how the urban canopy is doing, what the species are, how we're balancing all the trade-offs. So the answer is yes, but I'm sorry I don't have a more precise version of yes to share.
Great, thank you. The next one goes to Dr. Johnson, which is 53 tribes in the region are also hydropower customers of the Colorado River Storage Project. Have the tribes been encouraging federal assistance to help in replacing power resources with a severe decline in hydropower production?
To be honest with you, I really don't know the answer to that. You know, a lot of times there's just a lack of communication. Things are just heavily dependent upon what the outside world says, and sometimes they don't trickle down enough to the tribes to even let them know what's going on. So at the Hopi Reservation, we've actually, put a new groundwater system in, which is going to be pretty good here. But for the rest of the Colorado River Basin tribes, it just worries me that they're not being communicated well enough in order for them to figure out what happens when something happens like that. So I just don't have the answer to that question. But that's how I see it.
Okay. Clayton, go ahead. I thought you might have something.
We deliver power to 53 tribes. The biggest, of course, is the Navajo Nation, but the Hopis are one of the 53. This is a terrible deal for everybody, including the tribes, that due to a lack of water, we're cutting back on hydropower deliveries. And so we're trying to work something through, and we have a tribal conversation every 2 weeks, in addition to the conversations we have with our non-tribal customers to see if we can work out ways to make hydropower more valuable.
Okay, thank you.
All right, thanks. For Tom, how many new wells have been authorized under the revised criteria in the Central Valley? Oh, I think you're muted.
I am muted. Sorry about that. I did figure out my camera though. Under the drought executive order, not many, because I've been working with some people on that and doing these little study, and it's really varying a lot county to county how they're interpreting this. So there's a lot of confusion, but we're seeing a lot of drillers out there are sitting idle because they're not getting the work. So I don't have an exact number because it's kind of all over the place and it's a county by county thing. So I wish I had an exact number, but confusion is reigning supreme is really what it comes down to.
Great, thanks. And then our last question, because we're a little short on time, was for Clayton, which is, does the cost of hydropower vary seasonally or with demand from Colorado River Storage Project?
Our hydropower, like I said, is a firm product. It does not change. We have contracts where we sell hydropower. We are a nonprofit organization, so we only cover our costs. And as I said, hydropower has no fuel cost. And so it tends to be cheaper than other sources of power. And it's the same price all year long. We have to occasionally buy power from the market when we're short on power to meet our commitments. And when we have to buy, it's a hell of a lot more expensive in the summertime.
All right, great. With that, I'm sorry we don't have more time for questions. We had a lot of great information today from both sets of speakers, and thank you guys for presenting today. With that, Julie, you want to hop on here, and feel free to you guys to close your cameras. I just first want to say thank you for everyone who shared their time and expertise on the webinar today, planning the webinar today, and all the time that took it today. Just to remember, we will provide a link to the resources discussed today on the webinar page on drought.gov/webinars. And we invite you to join us at 3 p.m. Eastern for the Southern Plains Drought and Heat webinar, which will be similar to this, where we'll discuss drought and heat conditions and impacts in that region. So from NIDIS, I want to say thank you for all that have joined us today. And Julie, you said you wanted to wrap up here too.
I just wanted to thank everybody for showing up, and to NIDIS as well. This is the first time we've done this together, and I'm really grateful for everybody showing up, and to the NIDIS team for doing this jointly. And we're really excited for your feedback, and to all of you for being here, and really looking to do more of these and make sure they're as useful as they can be in the future. So thank you to NIDIS, and thank you to all of the participants. Really, really appreciate being here and all of your participation. That's it. And thank you, Amanda, for running the show gracefully, and for everybody behind the scenes of that, making it go smoothly. Great job.
Great, thanks, Julie. And then with that, I'll go ahead and conclude today's webinar. And just a reminder, there is a short post survey if you'd like to tell us how we did today, how you'll use the information, things like that. So thanks, everyone, and hope you have a great day.